Hey, Cypher here with another edit of the streams I did with Emperor Tigerstar. We set out to figure out how the art form of propaganda became so terrible, yet seemingly effective. We started in 1919 and moved chronologically to this, the final one, which was about Tucker Carlson's peripheral media associated with his interview of Vladimir Putin. By this point, the propaganda we'd been watching had become incredibly inept, which was kind of sad to see. I'd actually rather liked much of the early stuff, but the most recent ones were the most important to cover, hence why I've edited those first, because they are genuinely hindering our collective understanding of history. And Tucker's was no exception, leaving us at a loss to explain its popularity. We did discuss the overall decline as quantity over quality, and the general deterioration of societal media literacy, all worsened by technology and political polarization. So let's see just how bad propaganda has become. Thanks to my patrons on Patreon and Aura for sponsoring this episode. They are a digital protection company that monitors your accounts and further secures them. Something we'll be talking about in this video is Russian troll farms, and those organizations gained a massive toehold by learning about their intended targets because we have so much data just open to discover. Then they in turn use VPNs to mask their misdeeds. So much misery can come from lacking privacy, yet so many places that store your personal data gets leaked. Then that data makes its way into spam and scam directories. I know I've certainly had that happen a few times. Aura has an all-encompassing set of tools for determining what breaches have happened, capturing that data, removing as much as possible, advising when you need to change accounts or passwords, and securing everything, including their own credit monitoring, virtual private network, and antivirus. That way you can counter Russian trolls by checking out Aura, which you can get a 14-day free trial with aura.com/cynicalhistorian, which will allow you to see if any of your data has been exposed. That's aura.com/cynicalhistorian for a free 14-day trial. Thanks to Aura for sponsoring, and on with the show.
We have kind of a key question we have to answer when talking about this particular piece of media and it being propaganda. Very clearly the public thinks that it's propaganda, but theoretically it is actually a piece of journalism.
But it lets Putin spout propaganda and put it on display.
Yes.
I don't know if we're just doing the interview or if we're also doing the bits where Tucker Carlson is like having his adventure in Moscow or whatever.
I figured that would actually be really important to show because those parts are kind of what make it propaganda.
Exactly.
Kind of the goal with this last episode is to, one, gauge the state of propaganda as an art form, of course. That's kind of been the whole point of this series. But also see how foreign propaganda affects ours. We've talked about this a lot, especially with like the Why We Fight series and how it was actually heavily affected by Nazi propaganda. The Russians have been getting particularly good at propaganda. Or I should not say propaganda, but disinformation, which is a key component of propaganda. That has been affecting the United States pretty heavily.
Remember, during the 2012 election, the most famous moment of the debates was when Mitt Romney said, our biggest geopolitical threat in the near future is going to be Russia. And Obama gave the lie and said,
because a few months ago, when you were asked what's the biggest geopolitical threat facing America, you said Russia. Not Al-Qaeda, you said Russia. In the 1980s are now calling to ask for their foreign policy back because the Cold War's been over for 20 years.
Oh my God, yeah, I remember
Mitt Romney
that.
was endlessly dunked for like Russia. That's in the past. We're not gonna have to worry about. Turns out he was right.
Russia, I indicated, is a geopolitical foe. Not a,
Number one.
Excuse me. It's a geopolitical foe, and I said in the same paragraph, I said, and Iran is the greatest national security threat we face. Russia does continue to battle us in the UN time and time again. I have clear eyes on this. I'm not going to wear rose-colored glasses when it comes to Russia or Mr. Putin, and I'm certainly not going to say to him, I'll give him more flexibility after the election. After the election, he'll get more backbone.
This is how inept Russian espionage was in like 2010. They had this illegals program where they had put a bunch of Russian nationals who had trained to like lose their accent and everything and put them all over the country as secret agents who could blend in as just normal Americans. If you've seen the show The Americans, it's based on this, but the reality of the program was that these people couldn't do anything. That like one of them was caught simply because he kept on walking over to the Russian consulate and handing envelopes to the guard there. How inept of a secret agent do you have to be? They were incredibly inept and they didn't do anything in particular. That was the state of Russian espionage in 2010. And then we move all the way to today, where a lot of Russians are actually successfully planting disinformation into the American body politic. There's been a ton of investigations into Russian interference in both the 2016 and 2020 elections. Turns out a lot of the disinformation that's peddled is sourced directly from Russian agents.
Russia, if you're listening,
they will often set up troll farms where people are paid by the post to just set up accounts and just farm posts. There's a high likelihood that the amount of ridiculously bigoted comments that we get, a good chunk of them are probably actually Russian trolls. Since they're paid by the post, a lot of it is to set up kind of an online character, not only portray themselves as, you know, far-right reactionaries or freaking far-left tankies or anything like that, but they'll also pose as like just your standard like MAGA mom or freaking Bernie bro or something like that. Facebook had to do a major purge of these accounts and found thousands of them. Some of them had millions of followers and were being taken quite seriously. Russia's really amped up its disinformation campaign, basically since the illegals program was found out, and it's wreaked havoc on the American body politic. But here's a question for you. Where is the line between just plain disinformation and propaganda?
Propaganda, you're just convincing someone of something is true. If that disinformation happens to try to be convincing someone to believe a different thing, then that overlaps with propaganda. Yeah.
I mean, I'd say that most propaganda is disinformation. That leaves an open question of, like, you know, for instance, these disinformation posts, they're not just saying what their institution wants. Because that's what propaganda is. It's for the benefit of that institution. And it wasn't directly saying that. It was, in a roundabout way, benefiting Russia. So is it propaganda?
I mean, I guess in my mind, I still think it is. Even if it's not the institution of the Russian government, it is still a group of people.
Oh, it is literally being paid by the Russian government, right?
Well, then,
so
yeah, then absolutely.
But it's weird to think that a major Bernie bro group would be Russian propaganda.
But again, as long as it's trying to convince people of information, you can find ways to go to other fronts or avenues to spread ideas that just happen to align with the interests. It doesn't even have to be as direct as Russia good, America bad. You could just have like one little aspect of like, maybe don't get involved with Ukraine.
This is admittedly on the raggedy edge of the definition of propaganda, right? That isn't the direct message, and propaganda is about propagating a message.
Would you say it has to be a directly projected statement to count as propaganda? And would you say that more covert type things count as its own category?
I don't know what to think there. Throughout this entire series, we dealt with the edges of the definition of propaganda many a time. For instance, that If You Love the Earth or whatever that movie was, it took actually watching it to be like, oh yeah, this is propaganda. A lot of the time with the ragged edge is whether or not it's for the benefit of an institution, right? But here it's the other way around. It's whether or not it's actually propagating the message that the institution wants.
What we're talking about, that kind of disinformation is to propaganda the same way that counterintelligence is to intelligence. It's connected with the same front of trying to control ideas, but while one of them is about projecting what you want, the other is about deception and changing what they're projecting back. It's like a form of like sabotage.
It's almost like a mirror image of propaganda.
Yeah, you're like sabotaging their propaganda to help your propaganda.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. great word for this, information warfare, which covers all of this, not just propaganda, but disinformation. That's something to keep in mind as we get into this video, that clearly the public thinks this is propaganda, but I want us to carefully consider that question because it reflects on the entire history of propaganda. If this is propaganda, then the art form of American propaganda is getting co-opted by foreigners, the very thing that the Birchers were trying to warn us against. Let's keep an open mind on whether or not this actually is propaganda.
It reminds me of the people who were fooled by Mussolini towards the beginning, where, you know, they would coordinated places for the journalists to visit that would be polished up and look better than the rest of the country. So they would go there and they would go, say what you will about Mussolini's methods. They are drastic, but at least he got the trains to run on time. It turns out that no,
he did not.
the Italian
he actually had
Party,
worse train times during his reign. The classic dictator thing, think about North Korea, for instance.
The one grocery store where the tourists can go to.
One. Let's see what Tucker Carlson has to say about Russia.
Following is an interview with the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, shot February 6, 2024 at about 7 p.m. in the building behind us, which is, of course, the Kremlin. The interview, as you will see if you watch it, is primarily about the war in progress, the war in Ukraine.
I will point out the war in Ukraine by February 6, 2024 had been going on for 2 years. It started February 22nd, 2022.
Or debatably, February 2nd, 2014, when the bastards took Crimea.
A lot of Ukrainians would very heavily agree with that.
That's how it's actually classified on Wikipedia now.
Every nation besides ones very closely aligned with Russia have condemned this war.
One note before you watch. At the beginning of the interview, we asked the most obvious question, which is, why did you do this? Did you feel a threat, an imminent physical threat? And that's your justification. And the answer we got shocked us. Putin went on for a very long time, probably half an hour, about the history of Russia going back to the 8th century. And honestly, we thought this was a filibustering technique and found it annoying and interrupted him several times.
The narrative around that clip has been that Tucker got fooled into broadcasting Russian propaganda. He's starting this off by saying, look, we actually had a problem with this.
Well, he had a problem with Putin spouting off long bits at a time, but nevertheless, he still recorded it and he still aired it, so
It's
still
true.
a fool.
Literally within the first minute, it's already busting one of the key things that people have been memeing to death.
I will take only 30 seconds or 1 minute to give you a short reference to history for giving you a little historical background.
Please. I beg your pardon, can you tell us what period? I'm losing track of where in history we are.
I'll give you these documents.
Well, it doesn't sound like you're inventing it. I'm not sure why it's relevant to what happened 2 years ago.
But still, these are documents from the archives, copies.
What you're about to see seemed to us sincere, whether you agree with it or not.
Fooled, like I said.
Putin himself wrote an essay arguing that Ukraine was not a real country. And it's essentially the same argument that I'm guessing he's going to give to Tucker Carlson.
What amazes me about that argument, because it's something that I've heard. Yes, Russia and Ukraine have a common ancestor, so to speak, if we treated countries like evolution or whatever.
Oh my God, is it twins?
No, it's a map of Europe.
And here's baby boy number one. One more to go. And here he... Oh dear.
They have a common ancestor, so sure, they're linked. But Germany and Austria have a lot of ties, and they're definitely linked together. But newsflash, Austria is a real country. And, you can point out that you have a common ancestor all you want, but nevertheless, here's the reality. They're there.
The idea that you can prove a nationality doesn't exist through history is rather foolhardy. It just doesn't comprehend what a nationality is. It's a social construct, meaning it has to be constructed.
No, things aren't made up, Cypher. They're science and genetics and
Science!
Even the people who try to be like, race isn't a social construct, blah, 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 they're idiots, they're wrong. But even those idiots can probably agree that we construct nations, we build them, we choose to organize into nations. It is a construct. It is an abstract entity. It is not actually a physical thing. It is something that resides in the minds of its practitioners.
there's nothing made up about this flag and this country I serve. It was ordained by God.
And to American ears, that sounds paranoid. Tell us why you believe the United States might strike Russia out of the blue.
I didn't say that. Are we having a talk show or a serious conversation?
Here's the quote. Thank you. It's a formidable.
Because your basic education is in history, as far as I understand.
Yes.
I will take only 30 seconds or 1 minute to give you a short reference to history for giving you a little historical background.
Please.
Let's look where our relationship with Ukraine started from. Where did Ukraine come from? And it is considered to be the year of the establishment of the Russian state in 862.
Okay, that's the meme right there, yeah. One, he's talking about the establishment of the Kievan Rus.
That's the common ancestor, so to speak. Which, by the way, capital in Kiev, not Moscow, so it's probably more Ukrainian.
Here's the thing about the Kievan Rus is that the term itself is very much anachronistic. The first capital that we know of was Novgorod, and that literally just means like new city. Even the first capital, which is in Russia, by the way, wasn't actually the first. Furthermore, the term Rus at this point just meant like Eastern Slavs. To say that that was Russia would be like saying that the Anasazi are the true origin of the United States. I don't really want to go through too much of this interview because, like, why are we even going to try to debunk any of it or anything? Like, what's the point?
Typical American. You cannot disprove what he says, therefore you skip the challenge like the cowards you are.
But it's also not necessary for understanding Russian propaganda and how it affects American propaganda. Because while Tucker Carlson is a journalist, I'll begrudgingly give him that, he's a pundit, which punditry is a form of journalism. The tricky bit there is that just espousing an opinion is not propaganda, but he definitely has been a propagandist in the past. I don't think we need to go into everything that's wrong with Putin's perspective.
I'd rather point to an excellent video debunking many of Putin's previous claims about the supposed non-existence of Ukraine and his appropriation of Slavic history. Check out Matus Lazar's episode for that. Matus, or M. Laser, is a Slav himself, and he debunked so much of this propaganda before Putin even spouted it on Tucker's show.
I want to get to the Tucker Carlson being a propagandist part.
We can just skip over to that part.
Is there anything you want to say about the interview itself and the nonsense that Putin says before we skip ahead?
It's a very surface level. Explain your actions. Right. Here is why I am justified. Information you cannot instantly look up and disprove.
The main thing on Putin's whole defense of Ukraine not being a real country and everything hinges on the belief that people can't speak for themselves.
Well, Putin, if Ukraine doesn't exist, then you're just slaughtering your own people. Who looks stupid now? Oh, you don't have a problem with that. Never mind.
He sees this as putting down a rebellion.
A rebellion that was legally granted by the Supreme Soviet at the end of 1991.
Russia and Ukraine were separate countries even under the Soviet Union. In many ways, the Soviet Union was essentially a confederation, not a federation. Ukraine existed the entire time.
So what you're saying is that this is a lost cause trying to paint the Union in a different light than it actually was.
Putin just rambles on, and Tucker lets him do it. Whatever. It's his show. He can do that. The thing about this particular part is that it should be viewed in the same light as the Putin interview. Whether or not he broadcast it as separate things, he allowed Putin to broadcast his propaganda through that interview. Fine, that's what an interview is for. I think this is where we're going to see the actual propagandistic value of Tucker Carlson.
One of the ways you understand a society is through its infrastructure. So with that in mind, we're standing in front of the Kievskaya metro station and there's a train station next to it. Now, the metro station was built by Joseph Stalin 70 years ago. And the question is, how's it doing now? And what we found shocked us. That's not an endorsement of Stalin, who was bad, obviously, nor is it an endorsement of the current president, Vladimir Putin. You may not like him either.
You may not like him, but Tucker does.
There's no graffiti, there's no filth, there are no foul smells.
If you're in New York City, you could do a heck of a lot better than filming a singular hobo and a singular frickin' piece of graffiti. Come on, bruh. Be a better propagandist.
There are no bums or drug addicts or rapists or people waiting to push you onto the train tracks and kill you. No.
Rapists just don't exist in Russia. The rapists got sent to the gulags in the 80s and they solved the rape problem, you know?
That's what perestroika meant. For fear-mongering, he is quite adept at it in the American context, but here, he seems out of his depth.
And orderly. We're only going to ask the question. And if your response is to shout at us slogans dumber than the slogans we used to call Soviet, how does Russia, a country we're told is a gas station with nuclear weapons, have a subway station that normal people use to get to work and home every single day that's nicer than anything in our country?
So this really is just the trains run on time thing.
Yeah. Wow, I can't believe that a country has decent public transportation, something we don't have in America. Why is that? Well, let me get into the history of car-centered culture in America. Blah, blah, blah.
Although I'll point out, we actually have really great subway stations in New York. Grand Central Station is a frickin' world wonder.
Yeah, but New York is bad, evil, and smelly, and it has homeless people, Cypher. You can't use that as an example. Listen to the propaganda. It's better than anything we have, Cypher.
Even to just have a bit of introspection, a tiny bit of introspection, and say like, hey, maybe the experience that we are seeing here is curated. So it's quite possible that the bums have been cleared out. Even a little bit of journalistic integrity would require stating something to that effect.
Look, he claims that he has it, but he never demonstrates it.
He has demonstrated that he understands journalistic ethics and how to conduct an adversarial interview. Now, there's a lot of times that he's been humiliated on that.
But I'm just I think, a random Dutch historian who's basically saying whatever around the globe is thinking. You're a millionaire funded by billionaires, and that's the reason why you're not talking about these issues.
Why don't you go yourself, you tiny brain, and I hope this gets picked up, because you're a moron. I tried to give you a hearing, but you were too annoying for me.
You can't handle the criticism, can you?
And I would say that this is one of those cases. But most of the time, it doesn't rise to the level of straight-up propaganda. Here it is.
I disagree. Most of his segments are literal propaganda. The amount of segments where he's like, and this is why America is falling apart, and this is why wokeness has ruined society. Like that's what
propaganda. That's just opinion. Media that you find disagreeable does not make it propaganda.
But he is.
It has to be. It has to actually be in the service of an institution.
It is the Republican Party. I'm saying most of the time his segments are. That's what he got known for.
His cause was conservatism, not the Republican Party. The Republican Party is aligned with conservatism. He was not serving an institution. The only institution he was serving was Fox News. And now he's not even serving that. He wasn't doing that. He was a pundit. It was his opinion. His opinion is aligned with the institution, but that's not what makes propaganda. Here, it's not just that he's aligned with it, he's receiving benefits for this. He's prostituting any semblance of journalistic ethics in order to do so. So that's what makes this rise up to the level of propaganda.
We're just going to raise the question and wait for someone in charge to give us an answer.
Just asking questions, jacking off.
So we'll stop the lecture and let you take a look for yourself at what the Kievskaya metro station in Moscow, Russia looks like today, February 2024, in the middle of a war. Here it is.
You hear the music in the background? It's the look how nice the subway is. Well, the escalators aren't special at all. I was in Boston just a few months ago, and escalators look the same there as they do here. Whoop-de-frickin-do. Have you ever visited big cities, any place with major central transit?
Well, central transit, I mean, there was a lot of it when I was in Scotland, but it wasn't a subway. It was above ground.
I'm guessing that you can relate to this then. There are so few people here. This is supposed to be their big central station.
Yeah, Edinburgh Station itself, yeah, because it's basically got trains going to every part of the UK.
This is supposed to be the big, Union Central or whatever of Moscow.
Yeah, exactly. Like I said, it's the trains run on time thing.
Yeah.
Make it nice for the people who are quote-unquote investigating just so they don't ask questions.
It's just astounding how much he fell for it.
So a long-standing feature, maybe the longest-standing feature of Cold War propaganda in the West was the Soviet grocery store. No products, no choices, shoddily made things, and it wasn't actually propaganda, it was real. And you can look up the pictures on the internet if you want.
You know what's really reliable on the internet? Pictures.
You really think someone would do that? Just go on the internet and tell lies?
He's just kind of outing himself as a propagandist here.
Remember how we talked about how the bar has gotten really low?
Yeah.
This is what I'm saying.
That's one of those things that I still don't quite understand with 21st century propaganda is that while we lowered the bar in terms of entry, that doesn't mean that we have to lower the bar in terms of quality.
I can fix him.
Yeah.
It's not that we want better propaganda. Obviously, what we're talking about is we want newsreels to be a thing again. I want to go to the theater and have a transatlantic voice on the air tell us about the newest developments in American military might.
Americans fighting over an area extending 7/8 of the way around the world.
There's also just the artistry of that propaganda. Propaganda has been getting worse and worse and worse.
Just like the rest of America.
So we thought it would be interesting to take a look at a contemporary, modern-day, 2024 Russian grocery store 2 years into sanctions. You put in 10 rubles here, and you get it back when you put the cart back. So it's free, but there's an incentive to return it and not just bring it to your homeless encampment.
Like, has he never been to a fucking Aldi's? When I went to the UK, it was common in almost every UK grocery store. It's one of those things like good public transportation. It's just the standard in Europe when it's not America.
And there's a lot of things in Europe that we take as standard that's not common there at all.
What do you mean I have to pay to use the bathroom? This is why we left the British Empire.
But also notice the odd attention to there's no hobos here.
Homeless people, bad.
The main thing that he's concerned about is the number of homeless people. Under a dictatorship, that's pretty easily solved.
You gotta remember, not only is he conservative, but he's also rich.
You are a millionaire funded by billionaires. That's what you are.
Oh, good heavens, get the indiscrepant out of my sight. If I see a single homeless person, that ruins my view, and I simply cannot have that. Jeffrey, how much do I need to pay this homeless man to get him to never appear again? You could buy him a house. What? And have him not work for a living? You work for a living? I worked very hard to get my dad's inheritance. I'm saying he is a rich upperclassman disguising himself as a right-wing populist.
Oh, it's so nice to get out among the common people. The number of right-wing populists who are not rags to riches whatsoever.
You support freedom, but you forgot about the most important freedom of all, the freedom for me to do whatever the I want to anyone else.
Where the wheels don't move, they lock on the grocery cart escalator. Look, Ma, no hands.
Look, Ma, I'm pretending to be middle class. I've even got a grocery cart.
We have one of those here, and it's considered the most annoying grocery store in town.
Why don't you come to Albuquerque, Tucker, and then you'll take quite a left turn.
I knew I should have taken that left turn at Albuquerque.
Albuquerque is so degenerate they put up statues of drug dealers and celebrate them as heroes.
The low-carb lifestyle has not swept Russia. Thank heaven, because look at that. Oh, come on.
Now, here's a big critique that I have of this. And there's going to be a part where he checks out and goes, that's the equivalent of X number of dollars. See, that's not so bad. The average amount of money the average American has compared to the average Russian is not exactly the same. So whenever he's like, wow, these groceries for 4 people, it's only like $200. I mean, these days, that's not that bad. But it's like, okay, that is not something that like poor people in Russia can say.
If you're making the equivalent of $150 a week there, that's actually doing quite well. Here, that's poverty.
It's definitely relying on the viewer ignorance to not try to think about that. Who puts their jugs of stuff on their side? You stand them up so in case they spill, you dumbass. Like, this is an upper class person pretending like he's middle class. Oh, how quaint. I get to go to a grocery store and put things in a cart instead of having my butler do it for me.
Then I'll go to Trinity College. Because I am a legacy, I'm better than you.
If you do that with kids, that's a mistake.
I never put the liquids in the seat in the cart.
Yeah, it's just a weird place to put it.
The seat in the cart would be where I would put the delicates just so they're closer to me.
Bread and eggs.
Tucker
has run himself over. What a great twit.
I don't know if this is sugar or flour, to be honest with you. It's a very good-looking package.
Take out your phone. Let the frickin' thing translate it for you, dumbass.
Crimea, which not only has the warm water naval base,
Hold on,
it's Russian wine. It's from Crimea.
He's endorsing Russia's conquest of
Crimea. They've held it for 10 years at this point. I'd say it's a fait accompli at this point.
Yeah, I would say that, but any competent journalist would say something that this is literally war booty. He's holding war booty up and going like, look how sophisticated this place is. Oh!
Warm water naval base, but also is the source of most of the grapes in this part of Russia for wine. So it's apparently pretty good. But these are all seem to be Western products. Mars, Twix, Snickers. It's pretty non-sanctioned to me, but what do I know?
They had a supply left. According to Tyler, most of those companies pulled out Russia in 2022, but it doesn't change the fact that those are goods that remain perfectly fine. Also, there's entirely the possibility that Russia is getting a lot of American goods through illegal means. That shows that they are so needing of American goods that they have to go around sanctions in order to get them.
And we didn't pay any attention to costs as we were just putting in the cart what we would actually eat over a week. We all came in around $400. It was $104 US here. And that's when you start to realize that ideology maybe doesn't matter as much as you thought. Corruption. If you take people's standard of living and you tank it through filth and crime and inflation, and they literally can't buy the groceries they want, at that point, maybe it matters less what you say or whether you're a good person or a bad person. You're wrecking people's lives in their country, and that's what our leaders have done to us.
Very clear propaganda right there.
Because American companies and American government screwed over American citizens, that means Russia government and Russian companies good. It's like yin and yang. They're inextricably linked.
Even the comparison in terms of price falls apart because we have cheaper goods for a populace that makes a hell of a lot more money.
American baby, yeah!
Russian grocery store, the heart of evil.
Russian grocery store, the heart of evil!
Because compared to the idea of the Soviet starvation grocery stores, bread lines.
But it's not the Soviet Union.
Remember,
this guy doesn't know how to grocery shop, and he doesn't know that the Soviet Union ended 30 years ago. Is he that stupid? I don't think he actually is. He's just grifting here.
What things cost and how people live, it will radicalize you against our leaders. That's how I feel anyway. Radicalized.
At least he admits that he's radicalized.
Yeah, because he's been posing as a right-wing populist since Trump got elected. He's an activist fighting for the truth, man. He's radical because he's not a part of the mainstream media, even though he had the most #1 watched show on cable television for 5 years.
So one of the main questions we had when we came to Moscow is what's been the effect, the actual effect on the ground, as they say, of Western sanctions on in Russia. Moscow is the biggest city in Europe, actually, 13 million people, by far the biggest city in this country, and a very international city, a fashion center, financial center. And all of that ended in 2022, 2 years ago. So we thought we would take a look at what happened next. And McDonald's seemed like a pretty good way to do it. The first McDonald's opened in Russia in Pushkin Square in Moscow in 1990. And by happenstance, my own father was there. He was an employee of the U.S. government.
Richard Warner Carlson was an American journalist, diplomat, and lobbyist who was the director of Voice of America from 1986 to 1991.
Oh!
Good old Dick Carlson.
He's the son of a propagandist! That makes so much sense.
McDonald's franchises in Moscow were bought by a Russian businessman and renamed. Translates to Tasty. That's it. Apparently, not much else is different. So we've come here this morning in downtown Moscow to try the fare and render judgment.
I must say, I feel good in this weather.
I am a human being commenting on weather and enjoying said climate. Am I not a real person?
What's the point here?
If Russian McDonald's better than American McDonald's, it shows how much America has fallen and how much better Russia has gotten.
The thing that McDonald's is great at is consistency, not quality. And if he doesn't talk about consistency, I really have to question whether or not he's ever been to a McDonald's.
I'm embarrassed. I ordered 2 cheeseburgers, large Coke, large fries, and a chocolate cake.
Why would you be embarrassed about that? Oh, it's nice to get out among the common people.
I'll admit, I have not been to a fast food place in quite some time, trying to preserve my girlish figure. I should say, Putin banned GMO foods in Russia 4 years ago.
Why would they do something so stupid? That's just shooting themselves in the foot.
Yeah, Russia doesn't shoot themselves in the foot very often, do they?
Yeah, you're not wrong.
And they're still good. So look, I'm not saying one's better than the other. I'm just trying to let you know what life under sanctions, once Tony Blinken has written your country out of the civilized world, how do you live?
Oh, you got a little Alex Jones there. Added some rasp to that yell.
Gotta say, it was McAwesome. It really was, the non-GMO version.
Did he just endorse like the most hippie bullshit possible? Anti-GMO?
A week? Without preservatives, this food won't last a day. Look.
The politics that keep changing, you know. Used to be hippie to support freedom of speech, but then the left changed, Cypher. And now they don't like freedom of speech anymore. And now everyone knows that Ben Shapiro is the new punk rock. And even like the McDonald's of propaganda, this is like the Lon John Silvers of propaganda. Like, why even bother? You're just going to have a night of diarrhea on the toilet. At least McDonald's you can keep down and reminisce of, yeah, that tastes like the McDonald's I remember. This is just like, why?
The one part of all that struck me the most was his whole rant about how big government has destroyed our frickin' consumer culture.
Oh, if only it did. If only it did.
Well, there is that. But also, what ideal consumer culture are you hoping for? Because what you showed was lackluster at best. The clear political motive of this is to oppose any form of American support to Ukraine. It just doesn't work.
And yet, most popular cable newsman for 5 years in a row.
We're getting back to the Russian illegals program where it's just hilariously inept. They did a really effective job in 2016. Arguably didn't get what they wanted in 2020, but managed to sow enough discord to heighten American political polarization, which, you know, is in their favor. Just like with the invasion of Ukraine, we're kind of starting to see the cracks in the Russian propaganda apparatus.
The paper bear.
It is kind of a paper bear. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
Right up to the war, like most people would say, oh, Russia's probably the second most powerful country in the world. There was the meme of the tough Russian. And yeah, you'd expect like, yeah, they're not the Soviet Union anymore, but something like Ukraine, oh, those poor bastards, they're going to be gone in a month. I don't think anyone expected Ukraine to put up the fight it did. And while, yeah, of course, the Ukrainians have got a lot of heart in their fighting, I mean, obviously, but the amount of things we've seen of like equipment falling apart, the fact that they can't even keep up a supply line. Oh, the little mud got in the way. It's like, that's your thing. How are you failing at your thing?
The way that Tucker tries to spin everything to be about how great Russia is doing under sanctions and everything turns it into propaganda. Because we discussed at the beginning of this of whether or not this would count as disinformation or propaganda or both.
It's definitely both.
So I would say that the interview itself was just plain disinformation. Putin was espousing propaganda. The interview itself wasn't propaganda. But in combination with all of this stuff of, look how great their subway is, look how awesome their grocery stores are and cheap and all that kind of stuff. One, they're not cheap. Two, think about how much less the average Russian is paid. And three, that's not an indicator of how well they're doing as a society. It all kind of shows how inept this propaganda has become, and yet I see a lot of people lapping it up. So my final question to wrap up this entire series is, how have we gotten to the point that propaganda is so incredibly inept as an art form, and yet still somehow increasingly effective?
Standards have gotten lower. People have gotten less educated. The standards for fact checking have gone out the window. Everything is just, the bar has
What
lowered.
changed?
No Child Left Behind certainly didn't help.
With Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth, we were even commenting that it was like the old style of propaganda. It was already a relic.
We've had increased forms of both political polarization and removal of objectivism.
Yeah.
Point is, it's a domino. There's many similar things. Deregulation, but even outside of politics, like when it comes to like fact checking and research, when you just decide, I'm going to care a little bit less, people will cut corners more. That's why the standards are important in the first place.
So let's try to historicize this change, find a particular turning point of some sort.
Michael Moore pioneered this gotcha style propaganda. I think we kind of have him to blame for where propaganda has gone.
He's definitely a part of it.
Up until 2002, propaganda is major institutions trying to gather as much media acclaim as they can for their particular issue. Michael Moore is able to be like, I have a particular issue, it aligns with an institution, so I'm getting my funding that way, and then I'm just going to make a movie oriented around that. That's kind of what propaganda has become. It's less about making an argument and more about pushing your point while having a semblance of an argument. It's subtle.
Well, that's why I'm having a hard time answering this other than things fall apart, because it's so many little ticks here and there over time across a 20 to 30 year period.
Michael Moore was playing off of political polarization even in 2002, right? Political polarization had been a process for 20 years at that point. He had that factor. And then there's also the technology factor, that recording and producing a documentary had become significantly cheaper even in 2002. It's become a lot easier to produce things, lowering the barrier to entry for propaganda, which is obviously a significant... Yeah, but that still doesn't explain the relinquishing of needing to make a proper argument.
Especially with the rise of the internet, there has been a change on the number of avenues where you can have success now. You had to go through the proper channels, you had to get the proper degree, you had to go through a traditional job, work your way up, and play the mainstream media or the college or the whatever's rules. But now you can make a career doing this off the internet without having to go through those standards. And therefore, you quote unquote don't get trained into doing it correctly, or however you want to phrase it. But the people watching and consuming the information, it's no difference on their end. They're just receiving information like they always do. There's not even proper channels anymore.
But we're not really talking about the democratization of it. We're talking about people who are savvy enough to work around the system.
Just like how democracy has its lobbyists who get things done without having to be elected. In the media, you've got this. You can make yourself look official and just as proper as someone who devoted their life to getting a degree and doing the proper research or training on something. And either half the consumers don't know any better, or they're like, oh, what's the big deal about it anyway? Anyone can get a camera and talk. The prestige has gone down, and there's a way to work around it.
So it's not so much the technology itself, it's the perception surrounding it.
Although I think that the technology helps in that there's more, you're able to outnumber the people who are properly trained. You're always going to have more novices than experts. in something just by the law of numbers. You could have a crank that could be a local figure, like with your local newspaper, because at the time, printing enough newspapers for your local small town is a lot easier of an enterprise to spread information than a national news media or an entire college.
Local cranks used to be local, and now with the democratization of media, it's become more and more national and even international.
Most people would be able to toss up like, oh, look at them. Like they're not successful. They're just sore losers because the system didn't work out for them.
Now YouTuber is like the dream job for most kids.
The whole world is their market. Well, they have 1 million subscribers, so clearly they must know something, because a lot of people seem to think that they're right. Like it feeds upon itself.
We took a bit of a break and had a much longer discussion, but I think you all understand. This somehow turned into a lamentation for propaganda of old. It is not necessarily a bad art form, it simply has become rubbish that organizations peddle en masse to bombard the public into submission. That's sad, considering how glorious it was during World War II. But it is the nature of our current media landscape, and we all must occupy it today. Whether as propagandists, journalists, educators, or entertainers, today quantity overrides quality. Our politics are absurdly shifted to the right, and media literacy has degraded enough to make slop effective. It's an indictment of not just propaganda, but our entire media landscape. We actually went on for a long while, which I have cut up into another half hour of us talking and posted on my secondary channel if you'd like to see it there. And we went into a lot more detail about the overall degradation of propaganda as an art form. My plan is to eventually edit the rest of these streams and put them together as a whole series, so be sure to subscribe for that. Thanks for watching. Thanks once again to Aura for sponsoring. Be sure to check out a free 14-day trial by going to aura.com/cynicalhistorian.